Welcome everyone to this due diligence webinar series, and today we are discussing Kazia Therapeutics. Now, Karzia, if you don't know the company, Kazia Therapeutics is an Australian oncology company developing innovative high-impact drugs for cancer. ASX code KZIA. It's got a market cap around 205 million and a one-year return of up 91%. Now, today's presentation we're breaking up into 4 segments, and at the end of each part we'll stop for questions, so feel free to type the questions in the box provided. So the first chapter we're going to look at the kind of corporate overview of Karzia, the background, financials and the business model. Second part we're going to look at glioblastoma, which is a deadly form of brain cancer and the disease that Karzia's lead drug aims to treat. Then we're going to look at paxalicib, which is a mechanism for action and clinical data. And then finally, we're going to look at the new drug, EVT-801. We have with us the CEO, James Garner. James, over to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Tim. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's fantastic to be here, and I'm very grateful to the team at Corporate Connect and Share Cafe for the invitation to present. And as Tim says, we're going to take this presentation in segments, and we will pause after each chunk for questions and for comments and for discussion. So please do bring those questions. Please do type them in here. It'd be really good to try and make this as conversational and as interactive as possible. I'll say up front, I'm also going to try and make this reasonably introductory. I'm conscious there are some on the call who are very familiar with the company's story, some who are new to it. I'm going to pitch this at a relatively introductory level, but we'll really try and go into some of the granularity and some of the detail, particularly in the discussion. So if we can move forward 2 slides, please. Just start by really providing a very high-level overview of Karzia. And fundamentally, we are an oncology biotech company. We do nothing but development of new cancer therapies. Our lead program, as you can see on the left-hand side of the page here, is a drug called paxalicib. And that is under development for glioblastoma, the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer. It's in a phase 3 clinical trial for glioblastoma, and of course that is the final step in the clinical development of the drug. What that means fundamentally is this drug is potentially within about 2 years or so of an application for marketing authorization, an NDA as we call it. So we are very much at the business end of the game for paxalicib. It is a late stage clinical asset. And this drug was developed by Genentech. They are, for those unfamiliar with the company, the most successful cancer drug developer in the world. And they decided strategically they weren't going to focus on brain cancer. So long story short, we were able to bring the drug into our company. And it is, for all practical purposes, now our drug. And I'll come to that in a little bit more when we talk about Karzia's business model. In the middle of the slide here, you see EVT-801. This is a new addition to our pipeline. We brought this drug in April of 2021. The drug has potential applications to a whole range of different cancers. And at this stage, we're keeping our options open. We haven't narrowed down to a particular form of cancer. That will happen as we move through the clinical program. It has now started a phase 1 human trial, what we call a first-in-man study, that is underway and is recruiting patients as we speak in France, in fact. And so we're really excited to now have this drug in the clinic and really already on the journey. Obviously, some years behind paxalicib, but we have some things in mind to really try and accelerate and fast track this. Drug was originally invented by Sanofi, a French pharmaceutical company, developed by a company called Evotec, and again we can touch on that a little bit in a moment. Just a few words on the company. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, we're an ASX-listed company. We also have depository shares on NASDAQ. We have about 1/3 of our shares traded through the NASDAQ securities. About a 200 million market cap, cash at 30th of September of 19.6 million Australian dollars. So we're well funded for the work we're doing. We see that money last year well through the back end of calendar 2022. And so we're in good shape from a financial standpoint. Next slide, please. And we can maybe advance through the 8 boxes on this slide here, really just to build a picture of the year that is drawing to a close here. This has been a very, very successful year for Karzia. And I just want to kind of briefly touch on some of the high points here. We've had 3 partnering deals this year, which is, without one example, 3 more than many biotech companies are able to achieve. And that really, I think, has helped to validate the business model of the company, which is very much driven by partnerships with other companies. We actually made $15 million of revenue in fiscal 21, and that's something which obviously is going to be a little bit up and down over the next couple of years as we move towards commercialization. But it does speak to the point that that we don't necessarily wait till approval of our drugs before starting to make money from them. Really, these kinds of partnering transactions can happen at any time through the development journey. They can make a real financial difference to the company. And I think it also speaks to the fact that large pharmaceutical companies are putting value in the work we're doing, where we're able to sell our work through partnering transactions. It has a value in the eyes of larger companies. We currently have 11 ongoing clinical studies, and that's a very broad portfolio, which we can talk about in a little bit more detail. Between 30th of June 2020 and 30th of June 2021, a shareholder owning with $1 invested in Karzia would have ended up with $2.79. Really reflects a year in which the value of the company has started to be recognized much more extensively in the market. And as I mentioned, our lead program has transitioned this year into phase 3, our second program into phase 1. So we now have 2 very strong clinical stage assets. And certainly with Paxalosib, we've now passed the threshold of more than 200 patients treated with that drug, which really starting to build up quite an extensive understanding of the drug and how it works. Next slide, please. And this really just expands on the company's pipeline. As you can see here, Paxalosib, our lead program, dominates the upper part of the slide here. Glioblastoma is very much the lead indication here. This is our primary focus, but behind that, we do have work going on in multiple other forms of brain cancer. DIPG, childhood brain cancer, primary CNS lymphoma, and then brain metastases, that is cancer that spreads to the brain from elsewhere in the body. So this is actually a very, very diversified program of clinical trial activity. This is I often say this really looks like the development program of a much larger company. And we've done this very deliberately, partly to maximize the opportunity for Paxalosib, but also to de-risk this for investors, to really kind of take away the sense that this is an all or nothing bet on a single clinical trial. There are multiple irons in the fire, multiple horses in the race, multiple opportunities to win. And we've worked really hard to build that sense of a portfolio for investors. I'd also highlight here on the right-hand side of the slide, just the caliber of some of the partners that we're working with. Among the names you see there, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Memorial Sloan Kettering, unquestionably 2 of the top 5 cancer hospitals in the world. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, one of the premier pediatric cancer hospitals in the world. Some really, really strong collaborators that we've managed to bring into the Paxalosib program. And that reflects, I think, the excitement around this asset, the potential of the drug, and really also represents for investors a very, very powerful validation of what we're doing. And then at the bottom here, you see, of course, EVT-801 now in phase 1 and really moving forward very rapidly there through its clinical program. Moving on, I just want to say a word about the business model of the company. And again, this will already have been evident in some of the earlier remarks I made. Both of our drugs were not developed in Karzia. They were developed in other companies and licensed into Karzia. This is not by accident. This is how we really try to run the business. We are very much a licensing-driven company. We look to identify promising drugs that are not strategic for their parent companies. We bring them into Karzia, we build value through clinical trials, and we partner them out for commercialization. And you can see in the white boxes underneath here, really some proof points to each of these things. These are not just aspirations, they're not just pipe dreams. These are things we're actually doing in real time as we're moving the company forward. And you may ask, well, how do you know that you're getting good quality drugs this way? Aren't you just taking other companies' cast-offs? And the reality is that all big pharma companies generate more drugs than they have bandwidth to take forward. This is a lively secondary market for drugs in development. Many good quality drugs go through 2 or 3 companies before they reach commercialization. Great example is Gardasil, the cervical cancer vaccine, initially discovered by the University of Queensland, early development by CSL here in Australia, and then commercialized by Merck, a big US pharmaceutical company. And on the right, you can see some companies that have really achieved multi-billion-dollar valuations by following exactly this sort of business model. So we've consciously set Karzia up this way. It gives us a great access to diversification in our pipeline and the ability to leverage the really high quality work done by some larger companies. Next slide, please. Just a word on financials. This shows a trailing 12 months of our share price on the ASX. And as was mentioned earlier, it's been a good return for investors over this period. See some clear spikes in the share price, generally driven by data, which is a very good sign because it shows a market that is following the story and is receptive to progress in the pipeline. Balance sheet, as you can see here, $19.6 million Australian as at 30th of September. That, as we've noted elsewhere, takes us through the majority of calendar 2022 on current forecasts. And I would also say that we're really blessed to have some very, very high quality institutional investors on the registry. You see a partial listing of those here. We also have several others below the 5% threshold. And several of these investors now supported us through a couple of rounds of financing. So very, very grateful for their support. And of course, that has really enabled the progress of the company over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. And final thing I'd say here is just looking ahead for the company as we look through the rest of this year and as we look into calendar 2022, really a very, very busy time for the company. The early part of this year have been dominated by partnering activity. I think the tail end of this year will be dominated by some data readouts and by some operational progress in the key clinical trials that are running, particularly the phase 1 study of EVT-801 and also the GBM pivotal study for paxilosib. So it's a busy year, lots of catalysts, lots of milestones, lots of progress to report, and I think that will stretch through into calendar 2022 as we move forward. So I'm going to pause there and really welcome any questions on this more corporate part of the presentation, and then we can move on and talk a little bit more about the science.
Thanks, James. Just quickly, some questions. So you're a licensing-driven company. How do you think about the right size of drugs for your portfolio? Is there a right number that you want to be developing?
And this is something we sort of debate internally in the company quite frequently. And in some ways, it's a question that it's a question of portfolio theory. It's a question that any fund manager debates, when they have to decide how many investments to hold in a portfolio, and the difference between 2 and 8 is very different from the difference between, say, 20 and 100. It's a little bit more complex here because each of these are very, very unique prospects, and the work that we put into them, the capital requirements, the contribution they make to the shape of the company, it's very unique in each case. When we brought EVT-801 in, we were actually looking in parallel at another opportunity, which was a little bit earlier stage and a little bit more complex. We took the view that we didn't have the capacity to take that asset on. I'm quite glad we didn't, but we did have the capacity for EVT-801. So each one is a unique case. But look, I think the number for us ultimately is probably going to be somewhere between 3 and 5. I think we would like to see further growth in the pipeline. Once you get too big, you just become a different sort of business. We really become a spec pharma company more than a biotech company. That's worked great for some companies. Shire, for instance, followed exactly that journey and sold out for some tens of billions of dollars to Takeda at the end. But I think that's not quite what we're ready for yet. We're probably looking to have somewhere around 2, 3, 4 drugs in the pipeline, really good quality, and really be able to focus on them and do them justice.
And when you think about a partner, can you talk us through the example, for example, with Simcere, which is a Chinese-based pharmaceutical partnership, and how that came about and why?
Yeah, I mean, in general terms, this is very much a sort of risk-reward sort of calculus, in the sense that the earlier we partner, the more risk and the more cost the partner takes on. The later we partner, the greater the value we realize. And we think very carefully about how to find the right balance between those. But there is also another development here, that the partners can bring unique capabilities to the development and particularly to the commercialization of the drug that we don't have in Karzia. And that was a big part of the thinking with Simcere. We made good money there. We made an 11 million upfront, up to 281 million in milestones, mid to high teen royalties. Great deal by China standards. That's all US dollars. But we've also got a fantastic drug development capability in China. This is a very complex market to develop drugs, and having the Simcere team to work alongside us has been an absolute godsend. We just recently submitted our regulatory filing for the GBM Agile study in China. I don't think we would have been able to do that as quickly without the support of the Simcere team. So it's also partly a question of capabilities as much as economics.
And before we move forward, there's just one more question here on your lead drug candidate, paxilosib. It's now in a phase 3 study. There's a question here, FDA often require 2 phase 3 trials. Is that likely?
That's right. So the standard legal requirement for registration of a new drug in the US is 2 well-designed, well-powered studies. Now, in oncology, that requirement is often waived or adapted, because it's recognized that, particularly in a terminal disease, if you've got one study that shows positive data, it can often be unethical as well as impractical to conduct a second duplicative one. So what we often see is companies that will sometimes have some sort of second study in a different disease, or some sort of post-marketing commitment, or often just rely on one study altogether. Now, the GBM Agile pivotal study, which we'll come to in a moment, study we're doing, has actually been designed so that statistically it emulates 2 studies. Although it is in reality one single study, it actually resembles 2 from a mathematical standpoint. It has the same statistical power as 2 independent studies. So there's some really clever statistics there that gives us the force of 2 studies, and FDA has accepted that premise. So in this case, we're effectively going to FDA with 2 studies, even though in a practical sense, it's really just 1.
Understood, James. Now we'll let you continue and talk about glioblastoma.
Thanks, Tim. We'll jump forward 2 slides here, and I'll just ask to advance twice here on this slide. I just always start talking about this disease here by acknowledging a kind of elephant in the room, which is this is a really difficult disease to treat. And I often make this comparison with lung cancer, where we've seen 20 new drugs approved in the last decade for that disease. By comparison, the only news this century for glioblastoma has been the approval of Avastin, which was in around 2008, 2009, only approved for very late stage glioblastoma patients, and only approved in the United States and 1 or 2 other countries, not approved in Europe, not approved here in Australia, for example. The standard of care is still the drug you see here, Temodar, back in the late 1990s. And this is at once a positive and a negative. Positive in the sense it's relatively unclaimed territory. I think any new drug coming into this disease area has a kind of first mover advantage, which is very precious. This is the exact opposite of a congested area like lung cancer. But it also has a moment that gives us pause for thought, which is the question of just why this has been so difficult and what we're going to bring to it that's different. And on the next slide, we've really tried to touch on some of those points. And I think the key thing I would highlight here is the first item on the list, which is the fact that we bring a drug that crosses the blood-brain barrier. And this is at once a technical nuance and a fundamental point. Most of the cancer drugs we have do not get into the brain. They don't really get to the tumor in very high concentrations. Paxilosib was designed to do that. It does it very well. And it's one of the things that really makes this a unique drug in the global pipeline, almost unique at least. And so we really think we have something different to play for here. We bring something new to this disease area. And I think that's what makes us feel excited rather than intimidated by the scarcity of new drugs in glioblastoma. moving forward and just say a little bit about the disease itself, and I won't labor the point here, but this is round about the kind of 18th, 19th most common cancer in the world, about 130,000 patients a year worldwide. So this is not a rare disease. It's not as common as lung cancer or breast cancer or prostate cancer, but by no means a rare condition. Average life expectancy with best available care is about 12 to 15 months. And that has not changed since the last century. So this is, as I often say, very much the definition of unmet clinical need. This is a disease crying out for new therapies, and usually sized conservatively at about a $1.5 billion US commercial opportunity. So really quite a substantial market for a company like ours. I think if we can claim even a reasonable part of this is a very real commercial opportunity for us. Moving ahead onto the next slide, I'll just say briefly a word about the current standard of care here. And I don't want to get too deeply into the clinical detail, but I think this really helps to understand exactly where we're positioning paxilosib, because it is a little bit of an uncommon approach. And today, a patient who's diagnosed with glioblastoma goes into a 3-part treatment regimen called the STUP regimen. And that comprises, first of all, surgery to remove as much of the tumor as possible. That's then followed by radiotherapy, and then up to 6 months of treatment with this drug, Temodar, also called temozolomide. And that drug's been around for about 20 years, now off patent, widely genericized, but still very much the standard of care for this disease. So this 3-part treatment is pretty much ubiquitous everywhere in the world. This has been the standard of care for this disease for about 20 years or more. And it does work, but in particular, the temozolomide, the light blue box at the right-hand edge of this slide, we know only works for about 1/3 of patients. And for those patients, it will extend life by about 6 or 7 months. But for the remaining 2/3 of patients, temozolomide offers no clinical benefit. So we have a situation where the only FDA-approved drug for first-line treatment is ineffective for 2/3 of the patients. And what's even more unusual is we can identify those patients prospectively. We can tell in advance whether a patient will ever respond or not to temozolomide. It's a little genetic test we do on a sample of the tumor. And if you're in the lucky 1/3 that respond, as I say, you get about a 7-month benefit. If you're in the 2/3 of patients that don't respond, temozolomide will not help you. And so that's really our target with paxilosib. We are trying to develop the drug for the 2/3 of patients who will never receive benefit for temozolomide. For those patients, there is no alternative therapy. There is no alternative drug treatment they can try. And that's the gap that we're trying to fill with paxilosib. So again, I'll pause here for a moment and just see if there's any questions or comments here. Just a very brief whirlwind tour of glioblastoma as a disease area, but then we can move into talking a little bit about the paxilosib data.
Thanks, James. Obviously, there's a surge in drugs for treating lung cancer, and brain cancer since 2010 has almost been left alone. Is that because there's a focus on the financial reward of lung cancer, and there's obviously a lot more people affected by lung cancer? And is that also, do we have to consider there's been some failure for brain cancer drugs in this area as well?
Yeah, Tim, I think both are entirely valid points, but perhaps the first one less so now. There used to be a sense in cancer drug development that you were looking for these really big indications: lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, bowel cancer. And that's been a lot of the focus. However, those are getting really congested. And these days, no drug is approved for lung cancer as an entirety. It's usually approved for very, very specific subtypes of lung cancer. For example, one of the categories in lung cancer these days are class of drugs called ALK inhibitors. They're used for about 2% of lung cancer patients, which ends up being about the same sort of number as glioblastoma patients. So I think this has become very, very, these big diseases have really become broken up into a lot of smaller diseases. So the sense that glioblastoma is a smaller opportunity is really not the case anymore. I think this is as large as many drugs in the global pipeline, even in much larger companies. I think the fact that this has been a challenging disease has also probably weighed on things historically. There are just simply easier targets to chase. But I think that, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked now. So I think we're starting to see companies with renewed focus on these perhaps slightly harder cancers. Melanoma, for example, over the last 5 or 8 years, pancreatic cancer to some extent, and diseases like glioblastoma. So I think the tide is very much in our favor in that sense.
And there's a few questions coming through. Are there any competitive drugs competing with Paxlovid in this area at the moment?
There are. There's pretty much no disease known to mankind where there's only one drug in development, and that's true of glioblastoma as well. There's 2 other drugs in the pivotal study that we're part of, GB and Agile, which we'll come to in a moment. And there are other drugs behind those in other clinical trials. There's not very many. There's about a dozen or so drugs in the global pipeline that we track with any seriousness. And some of those already are starting to look less promising. What does that mean for us in terms of competitive intensity? Well, first of all, Paxlovid is ahead of most of these drugs. It is one of the most advanced drugs in the global pipeline, and perhaps one of the most promising in terms of what the data has been telling us so far. So there's no real sense that we're behind the pack here. We're probably in many ways one of the front runners. But also in drug development, as new drugs come into play, they tend to get combined, they tend to add to each other, they tend to expand the ultimate commercial market as they hit market. And that's very true of lung cancer, which is the example we just took. Those 20 new drugs that got approved in the last decade actually doubled the size of the lung cancer market, more than double the size of the lung cancer market. So we expect that will happen in glioblastoma too. So there's nothing fundamentally that worries us. I think there are other drugs in development. We hope that some of them get approved because they'll hopefully get used with Paxlovid, and that'll just work to everybody's benefit.
And James, just quickly, one more. There seems to be an increased focus from the FDA on supporting companies who are focused on pursuing treatments for unmet needs like brain cancer. Is that a fair assumption in terms of a changing rhetoric from the FDA?
Yes, absolutely. I think FDA is really starting to try and bend over backwards to support particularly these high need indications. We've seen that a little bit earlier this year in the Alzheimer's space with the approval of Biogen's aducanumab, where I think there was some real flexibility shown by the agency. And we've seen that, I think, increasingly in other forms, in other diseases, particularly in the oncology space. So there's no doubt FDA will work with companies to find a path to market. And we've already benefited from that to some extent with Paxlovid. We have 2 FDA stamps of approval, if you like, orphan designation and fast track designation, which represent the recognition by FDA that this is a high need indication. There's not much out there, and it's really in need of new therapies. So yes, this is definitely a much more collaborative space to be working in than, say, type 2 diabetes or hypertension or restless leg syndrome. This is a place where FDA will really try and work with you to ensure success.
Thanks, James. I'll let you continue.
Thanks, Tim. I'll move forward to the next slide, and there's a little bit of science here, for which I apologize, but this is what Paxlovid does. It targets a control pathway, a chemical control pathway in the cancer called Pi3K. And long story short, this pathway controls the growth of the tumor. If we switch it off, the tumor stops growing. And that's been proven elsewhere. Some of the drugs you see here, idelalisib, alpelisib, everolimus, they're approved drugs that target the Pi3K pathway in other places. And if we just advance very briefly, you see where Paxlovid fits into that story. It actually targets both Pi3K and mTOR, which is a little bit downstream here. So we're really in well-proven territory. We know that 90% of glioblastoma patients have this Pi3K pathway switched on. So it's a great target for treating this disease. It's very, very attractive, very promising. And on the right, you can see here just an overview of some of the Pi3K inhibitors in development. And as you can see, Paxlovid is actually one of the best Pi3K inhibitors that has ever been developed. It's more potent than most of the marketed products, and indeed most of the drugs that have been in development. And of course, unique in its brain penetration. And this has implications as we think long-term about potential uses of the drug outside of brain cancer, this is actually a really good PI3K inhibitor, and that has potential in lung cancer and breast cancer, a whole load of other diseases, but that's a little bit more in the future. If we look on the next slide, just at where we stand today, there are 5 FDA-approved Pi3K inhibitors. As you can see here, most of them are approved for blood cancers, 1 for breast cancer. What this means is this is a really well-validated class of drugs. This is well-proven cancer treatment. This is mainstream stuff. The unique thing about Paxalosib, apart from the fact that it's really very, very potent, is that it is also the only one of these drugs that is able to get into the brain, that is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So this is really a case of building a better mousetrap, fundamentally. We've taken a very well-established, well-proven class of drugs, and we've got a unique selling point to our drug that differentiates it from the field. And I think that gives us a really nice balance of risk mitigation, but also differentiation in this space. Moving ahead 1 slide, this is the most recent data we present, and this is about 10 months old now. This is an interim analysis of an ongoing phase 2 study. We're looking here at 2 measures. On the left, progression-free survival, fundamentally a measure of the ability of the drug to delay growth of the tumor, and on the right, overall survival, a measure of the ability of the drug to extend life. And as you can see here, on both of these measures, Paxalosib compares very favorably to the existing standard of care. Now, to be clear, this is a historical comparison. We're comparing against historical data for the standard of care. These comparisons are never perfect. This is an exploratory study. It is not equipped to quantify the exact magnitude of benefit. This really just gives us a yes or no answer to the question, does the drug do something? And unambiguously, that answer has been yes. So the phase 3 study, which is now ongoing, will measure really how well the drug works, but this really is looking for a signal. We are expecting to have final data from this study by the end of the year. We don't know what it's going to show yet. These numbers might move up or down a little bit. We're not expecting anything revolutionary here. Fundamentally, what we're looking for is something that confirms the signal that this drug is active and really validates our decision to move it forward into phase 3. Moving forward to the next slide, I'll just say briefly here a word about safety. This is a long laundry list, and I won't go through it in detail. But fundamentally, the safety profile of Paxalosib is very favorable for a drug in advanced cancer. This is not one of those drugs that makes patients' hair fall out, shuts down their bone marrow, makes them feel terrible. We really see 3 main side effects. Rash for some patients, it just get a bit pink and blotchy. Mouth ulcers for some, which is actually very easily treated with steroid mouth rinses. And for some patients, high blood sugar, which is an absolutely expected side effect of this class of drugs. All of those are manageable, all of those are reversible, all of those are really very modest side effects for a drug in this sort of disease. So one of the things that I think has been emerging with Paxalosib is potentially a best-in-class safety profile, and certainly something that seems very, very compatible with use in this kind of disease. So moving forward, on the basis of this sort of emerging data, we have, as I touched on earlier, deployed a very, very broad clinical program. Now, 9 clinical trials you see here. There's one additional one, which is just a technical study to answer some general FDA requirements, but really a very diversified pipeline of clinical research. And as we also touched on earlier, some absolutely first-class collaborators here. So I think this is really one of the things I'm most proud of in the work we've done at Karzia, both the breadth of the clinical program around Paxalosib, but also the quality of our collaborators. And if we move on to the next slide, the jewel in the crown in many ways here is the pivotal study of Paxalosib, which is called GBM Agile. Pivotal study, phase 3 study, registrational study. These effectively all mean the same thing. Fundamentally, this study is intended to get the drug onto the market. We're now about 10 months in. This started recruiting in January of this year. We're very, very loosely expecting final data somewhere in mid-2023. So that's not a very long time away in the long process of drug development. We really are at a point where things are getting very real for this drug. GBM Agile briefly is an example of something called a platform study. It's run independently of any individual pharmaceutical company, and it evaluates several drugs in parallel. Now, this is not a winner-takes-all design. It's not intended to come up with one successful drug. It really just provides a sort of shared infrastructure in which to evaluate these drugs. And we could have one or two or three or more that emerge successfully. But FDA loves this approach because it's very effective. It gives a nice standardization to the data, and it's really just a better approach for patients, for clinicians, and ultimately even for drug companies. So we've been very excited to have been invited onto it. There are two other drugs in it. Bayer's regorafenib, you can see here, was actually the first drug to join. And then just behind us, a drug called Val-03, which is made by an American company called Kazia Therapeutics. And this study has many things to recommend it, but one that I'll highlight is that it is something called an adaptive study. What that means is that it will only recruit the number of patients required to get to an answer. If it's very clear that paxalosib is working after, let's say, 150 patients, the study will stop there and we will go straight to FDA to look for an approval. There is no redundancy, no waste in this study. Normally, when we run clinical trials, we fix the number of patients, we err on the side of caution for obvious reasons, and we end up just recruiting more patients than we need. This study is designed to avoid that redundancy, that wastage, and it gives us a very swift, efficient, cost-effective path to market for paxalosib. And so this is a great way to be doing the study. Also saves us a ton of money. We estimate this study is costing us about a third of what it would cost us to run a study of comparable quality independently. So a really great path to market for the drug. And as I say, well underway now, about 10 months or so into the study. Next slide, please. Finally, a brief word on commercialization. This is something we're going to be talking about more as we move into calendar 2022. But I just say briefly here in passing that this is a very substantial commercial market. Glioblastoma, as we've been talking about, is about a $1.5 billion opportunity. That's a very considerable prize for any company, but there is a lot of potential for paxalosib to be used in other forms of cancer, both in the brain and indeed outside the brain. And we'll be starting to explore those as we get closer and closer to registration. So glioblastoma does not limit the opportunity for the drug. It's our gateway indication, it's our starting point, but we intend to use that as a platform to expand the use of the drug into other cancers. And as I touched on earlier, we don't necessarily wait for commercialization before we see any value out of this. Our partnership with Simcere earlier this year has generated meaningful revenue for the company, and we do have the potential for other partnering transactions as we move forward, and indeed other further milestones from the Simcere deal as we move towards registration. So we're already in a position where we're just beginning to generate economic value out of this asset. It's not that this is something that waits until an approval. This is something that's happening already. And then the next slide, and then we'll pause for a moment, really just summarizes some of these points here. Fundamentally, we're working in a space that's very well proven, but we've got a unique feature to our drug. The data all looks really positive so far. We're already in a phase 3 study. It's nearly a year in, very strongly supported by FDA and by clinicians. Well-funded, and a broad program behind that really diversifies the drug very nicely into almost all the key forms of brain cancer, and a very substantial commercial opportunity at the end of that journey.
Thanks, James. There's some questions around the commercial opportunity. How do you price a drug like paxalosib? What are your expectations around pricing? And what does that mean for Karzia and when it gets to market?
Yeah. Well, Tim, just as a kind of industry-wide average, in 2018, which is the most recent data I've seen, the average price at launch, or sorry, the median price at launch for a new cancer therapy in the United States was $148,000 per year of treatment. So round about 12 grand a month US. in the US market. Now, EU is about half to 2/3 of that as a rule of thumb, and then other countries typically a little bit cheaper behind that. But that's sort of the industry-wide average. There's absolutely no reason Paxlovid should be selling for less than that, and many reasons to suggest it might command a higher price point. Now, we've actually done some market research of our own, which we'll look forward to sharing more publicly in the near future. But fundamentally, the feedback we're getting from payers is very supportive of the drug. We actually think it has the potential to price considerably higher than that if we really wanted to push it. And so this is fundamentally a discussion with payers in the US, with health insurers, and with groups like that. In Australia, discussion with the PBAC, and it's really a country by country discussion. But all the signs at this stage point to a very premium price point for Paxlovid, and we think that's where the drug belongs.
A question here: will you be paying milestones or royalty back to GeneTech on success?
It's publicly disclosed. We have one milestone payment to GeneTech, and it's $1 million on first commercial sales. And I often joke it's a check I'll be only too happy to write. But beyond that, we do have some royalties on net sales. The exact amount of royalties is undisclosed, but very, very compatible with typical industry benchmarks, leaves very generous economics for Karzia. So fundamentally, our deal with Genentech, very backloaded. They get paid when we get paid, when the drug is on the market.
And there's a question here: when is final phase 3 data due?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, actually, because the adaptive nature of the study, this fact that the number of patients is not fixed, means that the range around timing and around number of patients is broader than it usually is. We know the study will recruit a maximum of 200 patients, but it might be very much less than that. As a sort of very crude estimate for planning purposes, we internally work around final data in mid-2023, but it could come in quite a bit earlier. It could come in as early as late 2022, only about 12 months or so from now. And it could come in a little bit later than that if it goes right to the final 200 patients. So there is a wide range, and that's just a function of study design and just goes to the territory. But mid-2023 is cautiously our sort of base case scenario here for final data. And as I say, in the world of drug development, that is the blink of an eye. That's very soon.
James, I'll let you continue and talk about your new drug, EVT-801.
Thanks, Tim. And we'll just jump forward 2 slides here. This is the final component of the presentation. I just wanted to talk about the new addition to our pipeline. We brought this drug in, as I mentioned earlier, in April of this year. The drug was originally invented by Sanofi, French pharmaceutical company, about 5th largest company in the world. But all the early development done by a company called Evotec, which is essentially a company that partners with larger pharmaceutical companies to help them develop their pipeline. It's a team of very brilliant scientists and absolutely world-class labs and resources. And they're behind the development of many of the most successful cancer drugs in the last 20 years or so. Now, EVT-801 is a slightly different prospect to Paxlovid. Whereas Paxlovid is moving into a comparative desert in glioblastoma, EVT-801 is moving into a relatively busy class of drugs called Angiogenesis Inhibitors. These drugs work by cutting off the blood supply to the tumor, and there are, as you can see here, more than half a dozen FDA-approved drugs already on the market. Very successful products, a range of different diseases, different commercial outcomes here. Obviously, a vast in the 800-pound gorilla of the category, but this is relatively well-known space and very well proven. Now, if we move on to the next slide, the difficulty that all of these existing drugs have is twofold. One is that by cutting off the blood supply, they make the tumor hypoxic. They reduce the oxygen level around the tumor. Just as if you put a tourniquet around a limb, it turns blue because you're starving the limb of oxygen. That happens at a sort of microscopic level with the tumor. Now, the trouble is that low oxygen levels trigger adaptive resistance mechanisms in the cancer. And so almost every tumor will become resistant to these angiogenesis drugs. And that's a problem. The second problem is that many of these drugs have multiple targets. They hit a lot of different things. They're very, very crude weapons. They're a sort of blunderbuss rather than a sniper rifle. And because of that, they have a lot of toxicities, a lot of what we call off-target effects. And so these are drugs that often patients just can't withstand for very long because of the toxicities. And both of these problems limit their use in clinical practice. Moving on to the next slide, we think EVT-801, again, really represents an improvement on the state of the art here for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it's a very, very precise drug. It very, very selectively hits a molecular target called VEGFR3. And we think that should avoid a lot of the toxicities that we've seen with earlier drugs in the class. Certainly when we put the drug into rats and mice and monkeys even, it seems to be very safe and well tolerated. So we're now looking to see if that's borne out in humans. Secondly, the drug actually targets a slightly different process. Instead of cutting off the blood supply, it primarily cuts off the lymphatic supply. Now, we all have two circulations in our body, the blood supply, which is well known, and the lymphatic supply, which is less well known. But you need both for tissues to grow and function in a healthy way. Cutting off either of these supplies to the tumor causes it to stop growing and indeed to shrivel up. And we're targeting the lymphatic circulation rather than the blood circulation. And that should avoid the problem of hypoxia. So patients theoretically should not become as resistant to our drug as they do to the existing drugs. They should be able to take it for longer and get more benefit. That's the theory. That's what we're going to be testing now in clinical trials. Moving on to the next slide, and I'll just briefly say there are multiple ways this drug can work. One is literally starving the tumor by cutting off the lymphatic supply. The second is actually that these drugs also seem to have an effect on the immune system in the tumor. And you'll be hearing a lot more from us in coming months about this because it's actually perhaps the most interesting feature of the drug. But then also, tumors typically use the lymphatic system to metastasize, to spread to other parts of the body. So by cutting off that lymphatic supply, we should reduce the spread of the tumor, reduce metastases, make it a lot easier to treat the cancer. Moving on to the next slide. And I won't kind of go into too much detail here, but I just wanted to show some flavor of the scientific data around this drug. All of these effects that I've just described have been demonstrated in the lab. So this shows the ability of the drug to reduce both the growth of the tumor and the spread of the tumor in a mouse model of liver cancer, as it turns out. Very, very promising results. The drug works really well in this model. And on the next slide, just some data that speaks to the ability of the drug to enhance immunological therapies. And just by way of background, the use of drugs which target the immune system has been one of the big developments the last decade in the treatment of cancer. We know that, that cancer is immunosuppressive, and by reactivating the immune system, we can often use the body's own resources to fight the cancer. Been extremely successful in some areas like skin cancer, completely useless in other cancers like glioblastoma, for example, where the immune system is very, very switched off anyway. And really what we've been looking for the last few years is drugs which switch on the immune system to enable these immuno-oncology drugs. And EVT-801, like many of the drugs in this class, shows the ability to do this. And you can see here, the gray line represents just untreated cancer in a mouse model. The blue line, the light blue line is EVT-801. The red line is an immuno-oncology drug. It's a mouse version of a human drug called Yervoy, ipilimumab. And both EVT-801 and the immuno-oncology drug work about as well as each other, but when you put the two together, it absolutely shuts down the tumor completely. So again, we're going to be looking at this in the clinical program, and we think this is actually perhaps one of the most promising avenues for this drug. Not the only opportunity, but a really exciting one. I think something that's been transformative in this class of drugs over the last 18 months or so. Next slide, please. So we've started in phase 1. Initially, we're going to be looking at the drug just by itself, but very quickly we'll be starting to look at combination, particularly with those immunotherapy drugs. The study is underway. It's recruiting now actually in Toulouse in France. And initially these studies are always focused primarily on safety and tolerability and on dosing and these very practical questions. But there is a lot of very, very cutting edge science in this study that will really help us to very precisely measure some of the effects I've talked about, the ability of the drug to act on the immune system, the ability of the drug to change the lymphatic supply to the tumor. We're going to be measuring these using absolute state-of-the-art technology. And so we're going to come out of this study with a much deeper understanding of our drug than is usual at this early stage in development. And I think that's going to really enhance its value and accelerate its development as we move forward. So that's underway. We're recruiting patients, and that's really exciting to have that started. Next slide, please. And so really finally, just to tie together, I suppose, the value proposition around this drug, again, similar story to Paxlovid in some ways. You know, we're not making completely new ground here. We're looking at something that's well understood, well proven, but we're finding a new angle on it, a differentiating feature. Incredibly strong preclinical data package that come with this drug. Unsurprising, given it's been developed by some of the best people in the business. And really exciting opportunities, a wealth of different ways we can take it forward, a very exciting drug to be working on, and really puts us in a very different place as a company. We're no longer a single asset company, a one-trick pony. We have two great drugs in our pipeline, and we're excited to see them both move forward.
Thanks, James. You talk about Karzia being a licensee company. Can you talk us through the process of how and why you licensed this drug?
Yeah, so we've always thought that we would have more than one drug in the pipeline. We brought Paxlovid in from Genentech almost 5 years ago now, and frankly, it's kept us really busy. It's been a very, very promising asset, a rich seam, if you like. We really felt we wanted to do justice to that drug before we started looking at anything else. But always the vision for the company was a diversified clinical portfolio. And very few of the opportunities that we've seen have really matched the Paxlovid threshold. There are very few things that we were as excited about as Paxlovid. This was really one of the first. So it's been a case of the difficult second album in many ways. You're really finding a drug that can follow Paxlovid and that we can feel as excited about as we do about that drug. But I think this one crosses that threshold very nicely.
And is that data driven and also driven by the economics of its potential?
Yes, Tim, exactly. But both of the above, frankly. The preclinical data, most of it is not at this stage in the public domain. It's not because it's top secret, but just we need to find the right way to get that in front of people. So we are actually working to try and get that preclinical data published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And I think when we do, I think everybody else will be able to see why we were so excited about the drug. I think there's a great data package, and it's very convincing. But also, we think this has absolute blockbuster potential. It's a different kind of drug from Paxlovid. It's got a broader opportunity in some ways and a more competitive landscape to navigate. But we think that this has, every bit as much commercial opportunity in the long run as Paxlovid does. And so I think both the science and the business converge in a very positive way around this asset.
And there's a kind of technical question. You had mentioned the biomarker work in the EV-T801 phase 1 study. What does that mean for investors? Is it of scientific interest, or does it change the investment proposition?
Yeah. Look, some of the output of this work is going to be technical. There's just no two ways around it. And obviously, as we get this data, we'll be sharing it with investors and really trying to explain what we see in it. But fundamentally, drugs that have strong biomarker strategies are more likely to get approved. There's good industry data just shows that kind of actuarial way. If we invest the time in this biomarker work, it just improves the odds of success, and substantially, not marginally. And that's really because the expectation now is for any drug moving forward, we really need to understand in detail exactly how it works, which patients it works in, how it works with other drugs, how it works in different kinds of cancers. And that's what we'll be doing. We're going to look at how it modulates the immune system. We're going to use some artificial intelligence techniques to analyze the CT scans in the study. So we're just going to have a wealth of information. And in early drug development, information equals reduction in risk.
And you've had a very successful last couple of 12 months, been a little bit quieter towards the end of the year. What does 2022 look like?
Yeah, Tim, look, I think busy is the short answer. We have, as I say, 11 clinical trials in progress. One of those a little bit of a kind of technical one, probably not much interest to investors, but 10 clinical studies. So that means a lot of data, and that's often what investors immediately sort of think of in terms of the biotech company. But I think actually for us, the focus is starting to shift a little bit. The data is really helpful insofar as it helps to inform our decisions and to take risk out of the program. But really for us, a lot of the thought process now is around how are we going to commercialize Paxilosat? How are we going to take this drug to market? That shift is starting to happen. And I think shareholders will really start to see a little bit of change in tone in terms of how we talk about the programs as we talk more and more about how are we going to answer some of these business questions rather than the scientific questions. So we'll be talking more about that in the near future and as we head into 2022. And that has multiple dimensions, market research, how we structure our organization, potential partnering activity. There's a lot of different things that play into that. But I think the question in a way that we've answered over the last couple of years is, does Paxilosat look like it works? All the evidence points to the answer to that being affirmative. I think the question we've got to answer now is, how do we build a business around this drug? And that's going to be our focus as we head into calendar 2022.
Thanks, James. Always great to have you on. Thank you for joining the due diligence series. Good luck in 2022, and we'll see you again.
Thanks for having me, Tim. It's been great to be here.
Thanks, everyone. That's all we have time for. We'll send out another invite for a new due diligence webinar in the coming weeks. See you later.